He didn't just kick her. He did it in front of a judge, a crowd, and a courtroom filled with silence, and still believed it would be forgotten by morning. Officer Troy Radford, decorated veteran of the Millstone Police Department, turned his heel and swung it into the chest of a black woman who had spoken no threats, made no noise, and brought nothing but a folder full of paper. The crack of her body against the bench wasn't loud, but the silence afterward? Deafening. What Radford didn't know, what no one in that courtroom knew, was that the woman he had just assaulted wasn't there to defend a criminal. She was there to end a pattern. And as she got up, without screaming, without crying, and without flinching, the judge's eyes widened. Because someone whispered her name, Danielle Brooks, Millstone's newly appointed chief of police, sworn in that same morning. And from that moment on, power in that room no longer belonged to the man with the badge. It belonged to the woman he just tried to silence. This is Cracks of Light, where truth breaks through in the places no one expected. If stories like this move you, if you believe silence is not the answer, subscribe to the channel now. Every story we tell shines a light on the overlooked, the mistreated, the brave. Hit that bell so you don't miss what others try to hide. Now let's begin. Wednesday morning. Courtroom 3. No cameras, no media vans, just the kind of dull buzz that builds in places where everyone already knows the outcome. The overhead fluorescents hummed against cracked, white ceilings. Paper rustled. Shoes scuffed old linoleum. And in the defendant's box stood a boy. Tall, thin, skin brown, posture stiff. His name was Jaden Brooks. Age 17. Accused of felony theft. A wristwatch. No prints. No clear footage. Just a shaky ID from a store clerk who couldn't remember if the suspect wore black or gray. On paper, Jaden had no record. In the room, he had no chance. At the far end of the courtroom, leaning against the wall like he'd built it, stood Officer Radford. Arms folded, chin slightly raised. His badge dull with age, but his presence still sharp enough to cut. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He was the kind of man who'd been here too long enough to make fear a habit and authority a reflex. When the clerk called the next case, his eyes didn't move. But when Jaden stepped forward, he exhaled slowly, like he'd already made his ruling. Another one, he thought. Another statistic wrapped in brown skin and nervous energy. He didn't see a boy. He saw a file waiting to be stamped guilty. The prosecutor mumbled through the charge sheet, barely disguising his boredom. Defendant was identified by a store employee as engaging in suspicious behavior. Item recovered at scene. He didn't mention that the store employee had mistaken a middle-aged man last week for a teenager. He didn't mention the grainy footage from a broken camera. The defense attorney, a woman with shaking hands and eyes that wouldn't meet the judge, whispered something about leniency and cooperation. She didn't challenge. She didn't push. She surrendered. Radford's gaze didn't waver. His job wasn't to prosecute. It was to maintain the mood, to remind everyone in the room who still held weight, even if the badge on his chest had long stopped shining. And for Jaden, that weight pressed hard, not on his wrists, but on the space around him. Like every breath he took had to be earned. When he turned slightly, looking toward the gallery, Radford moved. One step, hand to the cuffs on the boy's wrists. Not hurting, just a little too tight. Just enough to say, don't even think about it. The boy flinched. No one said anything. They never did. Then the door at the back opened. Not with a bang. Not dramatically. Just enough for the room to shift. A woman entered. Black coat. Neatly tied hair. A folder in her hand. No badge. No announcement. No hesitation. She walked forward like she'd been there before. Like she knew where to stand. She didn't sit. She didn't speak. She just stood directly behind the defense bench, and something in the way she held her spine made even the stenographer pause. Her presence wasn't loud. It was steady. It was the kind of presence that unnerves men who build power on being unchallenged. Radford turned. He didn't recognize her face. Not at first. Just another protester, maybe. A nosy advocate. Someone who thought walking into court uninvited made her brave. He walked toward her, slowly, casually, like a man checking on something beneath him. But when she looked him in the eye and didn't flinch, he frowned. Not confusion, not threat, Something worse. Uncertainty. "Who do you think you are?" he asked quietly, but sharply. She didn't answer. She stepped one pace to the side. Didn't move back. Didn't engage. Just made space for herself. That was enough. Radford's voice dropped into a hiss. "You're disrupting a legal proceeding. Leave." No one in the room moved. A bailiff looked up, then looked down. The clerk froze mid-keystroke. The judge blinked, trying to process the shift. And then Radford reached for her shoulder. Maybe to guide. Maybe to threaten. But before his hand reached fabric, someone shouted from the back. A chair scraped. A gasp. And then it happened. Radford snapped. A flash of a knee, a swing of the foot, and the woman went down, hard. Her folder flew. Papers scattered. Her back hit the bench. Silence. Not stunned silence. The kind that tightens the air. No one rushed to her. Not because they didn't care. Because they didn't know what came next. Then she stood up, slowly, one hand on the bench, the other gathering her papers. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She simply turned, faced the judge, and said clearly, "If this is still a courtroom, then I have the right to speak." And as she lifted the folder to her chest, someone finally said her name. Danielle Brooks. And then louder, Chief Brooks. The room cracked. Not like glass, but like something old and rotting finally giving way. Radford stepped back. Not far. Just enough. Just enough to show he knew. He had made the one mistake you can't undo. He kicked the chief of police in open court. And now the courtroom wasn't quiet because of him. It was quiet because of her. Before Mitchell ever stepped into that courtroom, before he raised his knee in a place meant for order, he had already mastered the art of disappearing in plain sight. Not from cameras. Not from duty logs. From consequence. His record read like a model officer's resume. Commendations, years of service, community outreach. But between the lines, there were cracks. Tiny at first. A patrol report where a suspect's name changed mid-page. A body cam malfunction that always happened at the worst possible moment. A complaint dismissed because it lacked sufficient detail. Then 2. Then 7. Then 24. By the time someone noticed, those cracks had become the foundation. And Mitchell knew it, because he'd helped build the system that allowed them. He wasn't just protected. He was necessary. The department needed numbers, cases closed, arrests made, activity that looked like safety. Politicians needed statistics to stand behind during campaign season. Local papers needed clean headlines and a face to print under them. Mitchell gave them all of it. He gave them results. And in return, they gave him cover. Every time a mother called internal affairs after her son came home bruised, the report sat for weeks, then vanished. Every time a kid was stopped 6 times in a month and asked the same questions in the same tone by the same officer, it was explained away as proactive patrol. Mitchell didn't hide the pattern. He perfected it. He learned to smile in town halls, shake hands with donors, pose with children for the press. And every time someone raised a concern, they were told it was an isolated incident. He wasn't the problem. He was the proof that the system was working. Until Lena. She didn't show up with noise. She showed up with questions. Not as an activist. Not as a rebel. As a cop. A new one. A careful one. The kind who read every case file twice and didn't speak unless she had more than one reason. She had watched Mitchell from a distance for 2 months before she even requested access to his arrest records. She didn't start by accusing. She started by logging timestamps, matching them against body cam uploads, and noticing which ones were missing. She pulled up the call logs for the nights he claimed to respond to fights and found number 911 call. She flagged the names of those arrested in what the system called routine intervention. Most were teenagers. Most were boys. Most were black. Most had no priors until Mitchell crossed their path. She printed every record, built a wall in her office with red string and thumbtacks. Not for drama, but because the department's search interface made it harder to see patterns unless you saw them side by side. Then she opened the files no one touched. The ones marked inconclusive. The ones buried in cardboard boxes 2 floors down from the records office. The ones with missing witness statements and in signed reports. One by one, she matched stories with outcomes, faces with charges, questions with silences. And a name kept surfacing. Aaron Whitlock. 17. The boy from Courtroom 3. Only now she saw what others didn't. Aaron wasn't an outlier. He was another repeat. Another profile in the same chain. The watch he was accused of stealing? The arresting officer? Mitchell. The supposed ID from the shopkeeper? Filed by Mitchell. The statement that Aaron had been loitering before entering the store? No supporting video. Just a form signed by Mitchell. Lena narrowed her eyes. She had been warned. Not directly. Just the usual ways. An invitation to ease up. A reminder that she was new. A quiet, smiling suggestion from her captain that going through old reports won't help your promotion. She ignored them, and she went further. She visited families. Quietly, in plain clothes. She knocked on doors with clip case numbers in her notebook and asked, "Do you remember this date? What happened that night?" Most were confused. Some were afraid. But when she mentioned Mitchell, something always changed in their face. Not anger. Something closer to fatigue. The kind of fatigue that comes from knowing you've already told your story and no one listened. She kept going. One night, around 10:30, in a small two-bedroom apartment on the east side of town, she met Ms. Teresa Finch. 63. Retired nurse. Legal guardian to her grandson, Kelvin. Kelvin was 14 when Mitchell arrested him for vandalism. Graffiti on the side of a warehouse. Spray paint still wet. Except Kelvin was at a chess tournament that night. He still had the certificate. Still had a picture. The charges were dropped, but no one ever cleared the record. His school flagged it. His future flagged it. And Mitchell? He never filed a correction. Lena asked if she could speak to Kelvin directly. Ms. Finch hesitated, then nodded. Kelvin stepped out, now 16. Eyes guarded. Shoulders tight. "What do you remember?" Lena asked gently, but he looked at her for a long time, then said, "I wasn't the one who got picked that night." She didn't understand. Not at first. Then he explained. "There were two of us. Me and Corey. We ran when we saw the lights. I got caught. Corey didn't. I didn't do anything, but I didn't talk either. I figure I'd take it. Corey had more to lose." But Kelvin trailed off. Then he added something that made Lena stop breathing. Corey saw what happened. He saw how it went down. He saw everything. She wrote the name down slowly. "Where is he now?" "Moved schools," Kelvin said. "After that night, he didn't want to be around. But I think he's in Jefferson now." Lena closed her notebook, thanked them, and walked to her car in silence. Corey. She had a name. A real witness. A living key. If Corey had seen Aaron's case unfold, if he had seen Mitchell lie before, she might have found a crack too big to patch. She didn't go back to the station. She drove straight to Jefferson, pulled up school records, confirmed enrollment, and requested a meeting under the guise of school outreach. The principal arranged it. Corey walked in, taller than she expected, with a nervous glance like he knew someone had pulled his past into the present. Lena spoke gently, didn't pressure, just explained what she was looking into, and then asked, "Do you remember that night?" He nodded. "Do you remember Aaron?" Another nod. "Do you remember what you saw?" He looked down at his hands, then back at her. "I saw Mitchell stop him," Corey said. "Aaron didn't steal anything. He didn't even go inside the store yet. I was across the street. Aaron was waiting for his brother to bring his backpack from the car. Mitchell pulled up fast, got out yelling. Aaron didn't say anything, didn't move, just stood there. Mitchell slammed him against the wall before he even asked a question. Lena felt something shift. Her pulse didn't race, but something inside her went cold. This wasn't just another bad arrest. It was a false charge built on a lie told in court, under oath, backed by silence. And now, for the first time, someone else saw it too. She asked Corey if he'd be willing to testify. He hesitated. "They'll come after me," he said. "They always come after you when you tell the truth." She didn't lie to him. She said, "Maybe, but they already took something from you once. If you stay silent now, they get to keep it." He didn't answer, but 2 days later, he showed up at the precinct, walked in without calling, asked for her by name, and handed her a written statement, signed. And that's when Lena knew it wasn't just about Aaron anymore. The pattern was breaking, and someone was about to lose control of the narrative. Understood. Here is part 3 of your story, written in continuous American English prose, preserving the sharp, focused cinematic style. It avoids flowery language and stays committed to the core events. Lena's deepening investigation, the fallout, and the rising personal risk. Emotional tension builds steadily without excess description, focusing tightly on plot momentum and character stakes. Corey's statement was just the beginning. What came next wasn't a press conference or a viral headline. It was Lena in her car at 7 a.m., parked across from a rundown convenience store with a drive-through ATM and a busted security light. She waited until the shutters rolled up. Waited until the same man who'd owned the place for 20 years walked out in his apron, coffee in hand. She knew his name from the case file. Mr. Patel. It was his store where Aaron had supposedly stolen the watch. She stepped out of the car and walked across the lot. Calm. Straightforward. No badge in sight. Just a folder under her arm and the weight of a broken case in her voice. He was polite but cautious. Everyone in that neighborhood had learned to be. I need your help, she said quietly. He looked at her like he'd heard that line before and it hadn't ended well. This is about Aaron Whitlock, she added. His eyebrows twitched. I remember the kid, he said, but I don't want trouble. I'm not here to cause it, she replied. I'm here to stop it. She explained the gaps, the mismatched statements, the footage no one ever pulled. She asked about the camera mounted behind the register, aimed right at the entrance, the one that hadn't been cited in Mitchell's report. Patel sighed. They told me it wasn't necessary, he said, that the officer already had what he needed. Your people. Lena nodded slowly. Do you still have a recording? He hesitated. Maybe, he said, if no one wiped the archive. He led her behind the counter, through a squeaky back door to a dusty office. The monitor still worked. The system still ran. Old but intact. He clicked through the dates. August 14th, 4:23 p.m. There it was. A young black teenager walking up the steps. Looking around. Standing near the wall. No movement. No rush. No watch in his hand. No entry into the store. A cruiser pulls up. Mitchell gets out fast. Approaches from the left. Aaron turns his head, startled. Mitchell doesn't speak. Just grabs him. Slams him against the wall. Cuffs him. Pushes his head down as he marches him out of frame. The footage was clean. Brutal. And very real. Can I have a copy of this? Lena asked. Patel nodded. Take it, he said. Someone should have a long time ago. She walked out of that store knowing everything had changed. She now had proof. And if the department wouldn't listen to a kid's statement, they couldn't ignore a camera. She filed it immediately. Backed up twice. One copy locked in evidence. One on her personal drive. And then, for the first time since she arrived, she sent an internal request for a formal misconduct review. Not anonymous, not coded, signed with her name. Within 2 hours, she was summoned to the deputy chief's office. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He did something worse. He smiled like nothing had happened. Lena, I get it, he said. You're thorough. That's great. But this could cause a stir. One officer. One bad call. Doesn't mean we dismantle trust in the whole precinct. She stared at him. It wasn't one call, she said. It's a pattern. It's 33 complaints. It's sealed case files and manipulated reports. It's a child being dragged down for something he didn't do. You're new, he said. Sometimes new eyes see things that aren't there. Or sometimes old eyes forget how to see, she replied. That was the end of the meeting. She wasn't fired. She wasn't suspended. But from that moment on, doors closed behind her a little faster. Conversations stopped when she walked in. And the IT team claimed they had server issues when she tried to access Mitchell's older logs. None of it accidental. All of it coordinated. But the city was changing. Word had gotten out. Not from Lena. From Corey. From Patel. From a mother in the East District who posted her son's bruised booking photo on social media with the caption, "Same officer. Same story. Are we finally talking now?" Comments exploded. Stories piled up. People who had stayed quiet for years began speaking in threads, in videos, in handwritten letters to the department. They weren't looking for revenge, just a reckoning. Local news stations picked it up next. At first, cautiously, allegations under review, concerns raised. But then the tape from Patel's store leaked. No one knew how. Lena had her suspicions. But when it aired, there was no turning back. The whole city saw it. Not in the abstract. Frame by frame. A kid falsely accused. A cop using force. No justification. No hesitation. Just power misused. Public pressure rose fast. Protesters outside City Hall. Parents in school board meetings demanding transparency. Council members promising reviews that should have happened years ago. Lena kept her head down. She wasn't trying to be a hero. She just wanted to finish what she started. And what she started was now pulling threads she didn't expect. She found a code Mitchell used in his reports, T4F6, a made-up incident classification that always preceded arrests of minors with no priors. Every time she searched that code, she found the same structure. Short reports, no video, one witness statement, his. She kept digging, found a stash of old radio logs, discovered dispatchers who had marked "no call received" on nights Mitchell claimed to be responding to community complaints. Discovered that 3 of those dispatchers had been rotated to desk duty right after raising questions. It wasn't just him. It was the system that formed around him, rewarded him, covered for him. That's when she made the decision to take it further. She filed for a full internal audit of not just Mitchell, but his patrol unit. 5 officers, all with records that mirrored his. They shared report templates, used identical language in citations, booked minors at the same holding facility. Lena contacted the DA's office, delivered a sealed folder with every inconsistency she'd found. 3 days later, she found her locker slightly open. Inside, her files were untouched, but her backup flash drive was gone. She checked her apartment that night. Nothing broken, but something was off. Her folders weren't in the same order on the kitchen counter. Her windows were locked, but they hadn't been that morning. Then the text started. No name, just a burner number. The first one read, "You should stop." The second, "You walk alone from the station to your car. Not safe." The third was just a picture. Her standing in the records room, taken from the doorway. She hadn't seen anyone there, but someone had been. Lena stared at the screen. Not afraid. Not yet. But no longer under any illusion. This wasn't just corruption. This was survival. And someone didn't want her to keep going. She sat in silence for a long minute. Then turned her phone off. Then turned her laptop on. Then opened her files. And kept going. Because if they were watching her, it meant she was getting close, and they were starting to feel it. It happened just past 11 p.m. Lena had been working late in the old records annex again. She parked on the side lot. Same as usual, steps from the stairwell. But that night, the stairwell light was out. The door creaked a second too long before closing behind her. She didn't hear footsteps. She heard breathing, sharp, shallow. Then a hand grabbed her shoulder. Another gripped her arm. She twisted fast. One boot came down on her ankle, but she pushed against the railing, dropped her weight, and slammed her elbow backward into someone's ribs. The man gasped. That gave her 1 second. She bolted. Her key fumbled against the metal door. The second man reached for her hoodie, but she spun, used the weight of her bag to strike his wrist. The door finally opened. She fell through, slammed it shut, and jammed her foot against the base until the lock clicked. When she looked through the narrow window, both men were gone. Not a word. No demand. No wallet taken. No phones. This wasn't a mugging. It was a message. She didn't report it. She knew better. She drove straight to a friend's house, slept with the light on, and the next morning walked into her office like nothing had happened. Because there was still work to do, Lena published the report. It was internal. At first, restricted distribution. But the moment it hit the inboxes of the chief's office and the oversight committee, it couldn't be buried. Not easily. It wasn't just about Erin anymore. Her data scraped records from 6 years of patrol logs, filtered by zip code, age group, and arrest type. The pattern was undeniable. Of the 512 juveniles booked by Mitchell's unit in that span, over 330 had no accompanying physical evidence in their files. Of those, 41 had no legal representation during questioning. 27 had charges dismissed quietly, but not before spending nights in custody. All of it laid out, clean, cited, and traced back to badge numbers. By noon, her phone buzzed with 100 missed calls. Not all friendly. A deputy DA messaged her privately. "This is big. They're scared. Don't back off." But as quickly as the momentum built, the silence followed. Local outlets that had once begged her for interviews suddenly stopped replying. One paper that had promised to publish the findings backed out last minute, citing editorial adjustments. A nightly news segment was pulled minutes before airtime. Lena wasn't surprised. She knew how fast influence moved when reputation was at stake. The department issued a statement calling her report premature and methodologically flawed. A week later, the city council scheduled a closed-door meeting on community relations with no mention of Mitchell's name. Lena watched it unfold like a play. People talked around the truth, never through it. Even some colleagues avoided her in the hallway. Eye contact vanished. Conversations trailed off. One sergeant she'd worked beside for years told her bluntly, "You're trying to take down the whole house. Don't expect anyone to help you when it falls." But something had changed outside the station. In neighborhoods they never patrolled during election season. At schools where parents whispered about another one. Word was spreading. Lena's report had leaked. Accidentally or not, she didn't care. People printed it out, highlighted names, circulated photos of their own kids who'd been detained, questioned, warned, and let go without cause. The silence from institutions only confirmed the guilt. The community knew what the data meant, and they weren't letting go. Lena doubled down. She contacted a federal civil rights investigator she knew from years ago. A quiet man who never showed up in press photos but made things move behind the scenes. She handed him everything. No fanfare, just the files. She didn't ask what he would do. She didn't have to. Then came the twist. A contact from a state-level watchdog office reached out. Not an email. A physical letter, hand-delivered. It referenced an ongoing inquiry into law enforcement corruption beyond city limits. Lena was invited, confidentially, to contribute evidence. Her report had triggered something larger than she imagined. Mitchell wasn't just a rogue officer. He was part of a network tied to statewide policing grants, false productivity stats, and misconduct buried under bureaucratic red tape. Lena's findings had scratched the surface. But now, the investigation was moving upward toward departments that had signed off on those numbers, toward lieutenants and analysts who'd profited from the illusion of order, toward retired officials now holding private security contracts funded by those same arrest quotas. That night, Lena drove home in silence. No music, no distractions, just the weight of how deep it ran. She passed a billboard on the highway, an ad featuring smiling officers and the slogan Trust, Honor, Service. She kept driving. Back at home, her lights flickered when she turned them on. The security camera she'd installed after the stairwell attack was offline. A notification blinked on her laptop. Access denied. Then another. Your account has been locked. Her email, her drive, everything wiped. She didn't panic. She already had backups. But it was clear now someone was burning bridges, and they were coming closer. The next morning, she met the federal investigator at a diner on the city's edge. They spoke in clipped tones. He confirmed what she already sensed. Her report had triggered not just our view, but a federal probe. The DOJ was watching, quietly, waiting for the final domino. But something else had surfaced too. Lena's name had appeared in leaked internal messages between two former precinct heads. "She knows too much," one wrote. "It's not just Mitchell we have to worry about." Lena leaned back, let that settle, because that meant Mitchell wasn't the story anymore, that he was the symptom, and the state was about to find out just how infected everything had become. The hallway to the interrogation room was colder than usual. Lena didn't notice it until the moment before the door opened. Two officers flanked Mitchell. No cuffs, but his walk had changed. He wasn't swaggering anymore. His boots didn't make noise on the tile. He entered without a word, sat in the metal chair like a man who had run out of excuses but hadn't quite accepted it yet. Lena waited a few seconds before joining him. She didn't rush. She didn't bring notes. Nota per ricordare. Just a thin folder she never opened. He stared at the table. "So," he said after a long breath, "you're really doing this?" Lena didn't answer right away. She pulled the chair back, sat down across from him, met his eyes. "We're not here to do anything, Mitchell. That part's done. I just need to understand why." He looked older now, not because of age, but because the weight of what he'd built and the walls he'd lived behind were gone. He rubbed his temples like it was muscle memory. I don't know what you think you'll get out of this. That's not the question, she said. You and I both know what happened. The files, the patterns, the silence. That's not up for debate. But what I need to know, what everyone needs to know, is why someone like you, who had choices, chose fear over justice. His jaw flexed. A long pause. Then, for the first time, he whispered something she didn't expect. I never learned how to make people feel safe. Lena leaned forward. Mitchell swallowed hard, looked away. Not really. I learned how to keep things quiet. How to handle messes. How to keep a precinct clean on paper. That was the job. At least, that's how they made it sound when I got promoted. His voice cracked. You show up to work every day, and at first, you think you're doing good. Then someone tells you the real numbers that matter. Arrest quotas, low complaint rates, grant funding. You start to see people as variables. Disruptions. If you can't control them, you remove them. Doesn't matter if they're 12 or 22. He looked up. That kid, Aaron, he wasn't the first. Probably not the last. But something about him stuck. That day I stopped him, he looked me dead in the eye like I was the one doing something wrong. Not in a loud way. Not defiant. Just steady. And I hated that. Because he was right. Lena said nothing. Mitchell went on, barely above a whisper. I was trained to command fear. Not trust. We all were. Outside, the hallway was quiet. Officers passed by, avoiding eye contact with the glass. No one interrupted. This was the conversation that had to happen. Not in a press conference. Not in a courtroom. But here, between two people who had both served the same badge, but made radically different choices. Lena finally said, You build a culture of silence, Mitchell. And you knew what it did. But you did it anyway. He nodded slowly. Yeah, I did. She stood. Then you'll understand why none of this ends here. He didn't respond. Two officers came in minutes later and escorted him out. He didn't resist. No defiance. No final word. Just a man walking down a hallway of his own making. The same day, at 4:32 p.m., the judge vacated the charges against Aaron. Lena was already at the detention center. Not inside, waiting at the gates, her badge clipped inside her jacket. The gates buzzed open with the kind of mechanical coldness that never felt human, and then he walked out. Aaron. Same hoodie. Same eyes. But his walk was slower, like time had left a weight on his shoulders that no one could lift but him. A woman stepped forward from the waiting crowd. No cameras, no press. Just her. His mother. She didn't cry out. Didn't run. She opened her arms, and Aaron stepped into them like he'd been waiting for that one moment for months. No words were needed. They just held each other. Long enough to forget where they were. Long enough to remember who they still were. Lena stayed back. She didn't intrude. She just watched. Then she turned and left. Her part was done, or so she thought. That night, something went viral. Not a headline. Not a leak. A video. Aaron had filmed it with his old cracked phone. The same one that still had dust in the mic. He spoke straight to camera. No edits, no background music. Just him in his room, raw. My name's Aaron, he began. I just got out after being locked up for something I didn't do. The truth is, I was supposed to disappear. But I didn't. Because someone cared enough to find the truth. And because someone else finally said, I was wrong. This isn't just about me. It's about everybody who ever got told to shut up, go home, or stop asking questions. I'm not asking anymore. I'm telling you. We deserve better. And we're not going away. It hit 200,000 views by sunrise. 3 million by midday. National outlets picked it up. Celebrities shared it. Lawyers offered to work pro bono for other cases like his. Students wore hoodies with his quote. I'm not asking. I'm telling you. Protests reignited. Not with rage, but with clarity. This wasn't just about outrage. It was about architecture. Changing what got built after the old walls came down. Lena watched the movement unfold quietly. She declined interviews. Refused television requests. She didn't want credit. She wanted change. And for the first time, she believed it was possible. But in the weeks that followed, something else changed too. More files began surfacing. Officers from other cities sent anonymous tips. Whistleblowers emerged. The Department of Justice accelerated its probe, citing systemic failures statewide. Mitchell's name became shorthand for everything wrong with performance-driven policing. But Aaron's name, his story, became something else entirely. A reminder that the system could be bent, but not always broken. Lena received a letter one afternoon. No return address. Just a note on lined paper, scribbled in uneven handwriting. Thank you. I thought I was alone. Turns out we're not. She kept it in her wallet, because for all the files, the hearings, the long nights and close calls, that one note reminded her why she'd started it all, and why she'd never stop. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't make headlines the way scandals did. But the change was real. One by one, old complaint files were reopened. Each folder, once marked unsubstantiated, was read again, not by officers behind closed doors, but by a new committee formed out of necessity, not PR. It included law students, retired judges, survivors of wrongful arrests, mothers who'd sat through courtrooms in silence, and community members who had nothing left to lose. They called themselves the Ground Review Task Force. Lena didn't name it. She didn't even sit on it. But it was born from the shadow she'd left behind. Its mission was clear. No record ignored. No voice left unread. The city of Millstone changed. Not all at once, but enough that other cities took notice. When people spoke of justice reform, they didn't speak in theories anymore. They pointed to Millstone, a place where one boy's case cracked the surface. A place where a corrupt officer's fall wasn't the end, but the beginning. Police training manuals were rewritten. Response protocols changed. Body cams became mandatory. More importantly, the data was shared, not just with internal teams, but publicly. Transparency was no longer optional. For the first time, people felt like the system could look them in the eye, and then came the flag. The city council had been debating for months what kind of symbol could represent this rebirth. Ideas poured in. Slogans. Statues. New logos. None of it stuck. Until someone from the task force suggested something else. A blank flag. Gray cloth. No writing. Nobody. Just a neutral surface. A reminder that justice is never finished, only carried forward. The idea was radical. Controversial. But it passed. The unveiling was quiet. No marching bands. No fireworks. Just a small crowd in front of City Hall, standing in silence as the old flag came down and the new one rose. Some watched with tears in their eyes. Some with cautious hope. And when it reached the top of the pole, fluttering in the light breeze, no one cheered. They didn't need to. It wasn't a victory. It was a reset. Lena wasn't there. Her name wasn't on any speeches. No plaques. No dedications. She'd taken leave weeks earlier. No forwarding address. Just a note left in the task force inbox that read, "Don't make it about me. Make it about what comes next." And they did. Aaron stood in the crowd that day, wearing a plain hoodie with no slogans, hands in his pockets. His mother stood beside him, her hand lightly resting on his arm. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. He watched the gray flag move in the sky and understood that his story was now part of something bigger. He knew it wasn't over, but had finally begun. Behind closed doors, in classrooms, in homes where justice had once felt like a word other people used, people were watching, reading, asking, demanding, and maybe for the first time in a long time believing. If stories like this move you, if you believe in what justice should look like, quiet, relentless, human, then share this with someone who needs it. Drop a comment below and tell us what justice means to you. Subscribe for more true, raw stories that don't just reveal a problem. They reveal the people who dare to fix it. Let's keep this conversation alive. Let's make sure justice never stays behind closed doors again.